is the division that we're looking to speak to this morning, because we really would like to encourage the brothers and sisters who have always felt that Israel was God's perennial witness for the years in which they have followed the Lord. And then there's young people who have just got to know their history, the history of the Jewish people, because there is really not much that will be of a greater witness than what has happened to those people, and largely in the lifetime of people who are assembled here this morning. We really are a very privileged group, that many of us can reach back to events that have taken place that have been so significant in fulfilling Bible prophecy. And then for our friends who may be considering these things, certainly this is the evidence. If this can't convince someone that God's Word is what it says, and that what has happened is the basis on which we believe the future will take place, then I don't think we have better evidence to show. So it's an exciting thing to have a prophecy day where we talk about the people, the children of Israel, and their witness. The Watchtower, however, is a little competition for this, because they claim to be Jehovah's Witnesses. And for those of us who know where the word Jehovah came from, then we certainly know what they are intending by that phrase. Although, as we have learned from the pronunciation of the word and the root of the word, we would not expect that people would understand God's name if they stayed with Jehovah and didn't understand the word Yahweh. But in Brooklyn, there it is, the Watchtower building announcing Jehovah's kingdom. And it's interesting to just note a couple things about the history of the name Jehovah's Witnesses. If you go back to 1931, this is just reading it from a very popular encyclopedia. I have no reason to believe that we should doubt this, but on July 26, it says, in 1931, at a convention in Columbus, Ohio, Rutherford announced the new name, Jehovah's Witnesses, based on Isaiah 43, verse 10, which we just read. Ye are my witnesses, saith Jehovah, and my servant whom I have chosen, which was adopted by resolution. Rutherford said he was inspired to select the name to distinguish his group of Bible students from other independent groups that had severed ties with the changing Watchtower society. And just again from a book that Jehovah's Witnesses would like people to read, Let God Be True, 1946, it states, the facts and prophecies prove that the natural Jews will never again be a chosen, regathered people. They have as a people flagrantly rejected the Messiah, his truth and his kingdom. It is a false hope that they must be gathered or regathered to Palestine and be converted en masse to Jesus Christ prior to his second coming, and as a sign of the early establishment of his kingdom. God's kingdom was established in AD 1914. And then Christ Jesus came into kingdom power at his Father's right hand, and this without any mass conversion of natural Jews to Christ. That's their established belief on what we read from Isaiah 43. And just one other, this is taken from Brother Cowie, Brother Ron Cowie. I'm sure you would know him, his book on Jehovah's Witnesses. And he states, in their official publications, they openly declare that they and only they are the true Israel. This ideology is known to historians and theologians as replacement theology. Now you need to remember that, because that is sort of a buzzword for people who may have a different idea than we do on what Isaiah 43 is talking about. Again, picking up there, after the Holocaust, many Christian churches and groups admitted that it is anti-Semitic in essence and disavowed it. For example, thus writes Dr. David Allen Lewis, a well-known Christian author and lecturer, replacement theology is inconsistent. It places all the curses of the Old Testament on the heads of the Jews today and transfers all the blessings to the new Israel, the church. Replacement doctrines are theological anti-Semitism. So it's kind of important to just see what we mean when we talk about God's witnesses in terms of what other people think and what we can reason ourselves from in Isaiah 43. But I'm sure that the great majority of us would believe that when we read Isaiah 43 verses 9 to 12, and in particular this verse 10, "Ye are my witnesses, saith Yahweh, and my servant whom I have chosen, that you may know and believe me, and understand that I am he. Before me there was no God formed, neither shall there be after me." And again in Isaiah 41, "But thou, Israel, art my servant, Jacob whom I have chosen, the seed of Abraham, my friend." Now this is referring to the nation of Israel, who were the literal descendants of Abraham. And it's important to understand that the witnesses that God speaks of in this chapter are not witnesses by their own right. In other words, they go out and they go door to door and they witness. Now, the witnesses that he's speaking about here are witnesses that God is God. So that if you very first thing you do is get it wrong as to who God is and what the witness is really all about, you can see that it puts the whole thing, or at least the whole witness, in doubt. And that's why I believe it's important to know that distinction before we get into our subject. For instance, typical witnessing in the Bible. Deuteronomy 31 verse 19. "Now therefore write ye this song for you, and teach it to the children of Israel. Put it in their mouths, that this song may be a witness for me against the children of Israel." The witness is God's testimony concerning the outcome between himself and his people. So we read the Bible and we see what God has said against what happens, and that gives us reason to give thanks to God that in our day, in our generation, we have such open testimony. So the witness that we're speaking about at the end of everything we say is to witness that there is a God in this world who's active. He's active primarily with the people of Israel, even though they don't want to be witnesses. See, that's a difference, a prime difference between the group Jehovah's Witnesses and the Jews, God's true witnesses. The witness of the Jehovah's Witness, I suppose they would think it's because we want to be God's witness. But the witness of the Jews is whether or not they want to be God's witness is really a question. It's they witness whatever they do, because their history is written in the book of the Scriptures. The subjects involved prove the testimony right while acting as unwilling witnesses themselves. Now, we live in very exciting days. To live in, since the formation of the State of Israel and going back here about 100 years ago, we're talking basically about sand dunes. Now you think there's 2,000 years of history roughly there, where people never saw this evidence. They saw what God's Word said would happen, but they haven't seen what we've seen. Now wouldn't you expect that people who've actually seen much of what God spoke about would be more active, would be more thrilled, would be more likely to go out and to talk to other people about what this really means to them? I think you can see that God expects much more of us. And in particularly as we get closer and closer to the time, look what he says in Joel 3, verses 1 to 2. "Behold, in those days, in that time, when I shall bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem," and many of us, as brothers and sisters, greatly rejoiced over this when we saw these things happen. I can't remember 1948. I can remember what my parents said about it. I can remember what my grandparents said about it. It was a great time of rejoicing for people who saw that the nations of the world came together for a little window of time to allow the formation of the State of Israel. But I can remember 1967 because in the June War of 1967, I was in this city, Brisbane. And it was one of the most exciting times to be alive for me, because we were talking, we're giving various talks on Israel in this city at the time the war broke out. And if you remember, the The misinformation that came out of the war initially was that Israel had been overrun by Egypt. And then we found out after a couple nights that no, Israel did a pretty good job on shutting Egypt down in the way they opened the war up. And in 6 days it was over. Now that's the kind of thing that I think we've got to remember. Those exciting days. Well, what's he doing now? I will gather all nations and bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat, and will plead with them there for my people and for my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations and parted my land. That's what we can now see God doing. He's bringing nations to Israel. So there's a number of things that we have seen, and only very recently seen, as to why nations would be attracted to Israel. And the witness gets brighter, just like the sun gets brighter as it reaches the horizon until we're able to see it. This is the exciting thing about prophecy. Now, I want to take a detour, which is going to take me a little time to go through this, but I never saw this witness when I first of all heard about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I've been led to believe that not many Christadelphians did either. I only found this out by reading books about the Dead Sea Scrolls as to see just how this came about. So I would say, it's not my own actually description of it, that the Dead Sea Scrolls are the greatest archaeological discovery of all time. Now that's going back to, what, 1947, 1948, up into 1956. So a lot of us were living in 1947. So we are being given a particularly strong witness of God at work through what we can see. 11 caves, 19,000 fragments, 800 scrolls, 200 of which were biblical. 4 materials: skin, papyrus, copper, and lead. And the writings or the languages: ancient Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Discovered between 1947 and 1956, and dated as being between 1900 and 2200 years old. And it's about the Bible. Well, why wouldn't we have been excited about this? Why wouldn't we have tried to get every little bit of information we can about what those scrolls said? And if any of you have tried to do that, it's been very hard to find evidence about it. We can find sort of the surface evidence, but we haven't found too much evidence about the scrolls until just recently. If you've been to Jerusalem, you'll know how the Israeli government has set up a museum for this. It's called the Shrine of the Book. And you can see it just through the trees there, that little top. It looks like the top of a jar. And this is from a rose garden just opposite the Knesset building. So it's front and center, this discovery of the scrolls. If anybody wants to research this a little further, these are the 2 books that I used. They're written by Yigal Yadin, who was the chief archaeologist at the time, and both of them are well written. A very good book to have in your living room, where people can come and just see the witness of what they found. The scrolls weren't in very good shape, as you can imagine. Sitting around for 2,000 years, you would expect that some of the sides of them would be corrupted and just eroded and gone. But there was enough on there to identify every book of the Old Testament with the exception of Esther. The Isaiah scroll was sensational because it came to light very early. It was complete, so it gave people a chance to have a look entirely at this scroll. And you can see, certainly by what maybe you can see it there, I'm not sure at the back you can see that, but you can see where it's being stitched. You can see where it's being ripped at the top right corner and it's being sewed up. You can see little marks on the side where someone's went through and made some marks on it for whatever reason. And so it's laid out, or a replica is laid out in the Shrine of the Book around a cylinder so that people can see all parts of it. It's really quite an interesting thing. I don't know whether you know that Brother Paul Billington, I think a lot of you would know him, but we have a Bible exhibition at home And the Bible exhibition has another replica of the Dead Sea Scrolls, where brethren have got together and they made something like it was in the exhibit in Jerusalem, and got a copy of the book of Isaiah and pasted it around. And then we found that we were getting people by the hundreds to come through. It doesn't mean to say that we were able to do much more than that, but we got a lot of people coming through to see the Isaiah scroll. Now, if you look at a map of Israel, there's two main areas where these scrolls were, or at least the scrolls I'm going to talk about, were found. One was up at the top of the Dead Sea, and one was down at the bottom. One at Masada, one at Qumran. That's a pretty rugged coastline in the northwest of the Dead Sea. You see a little road at the bottom there, and maybe even see a car or two on it. So it's quite a spectacular sight to go down in the Dead Sea and get to the point where it says this is sea level, and you've got so much further to go, and recognize just how much of a depression this really is in the earth. Well, there is this old civilization that people found, and they believe that largely these scrolls were made, or they were at least stored, by people who lived in this part of Qumran. And the Israelis have made a nice exhibit there, an exhibit area, where you can come up and you can go through an area and look at things associated with the people who copied the scrolls, and then go out to the caves, where many of the caves where they were found. This is probably the most famous picture of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's Cave 4, site of 15,000 fragments. And it's originating from many hundreds of composite texts. It seems that was a library. And the Roman soldiers, sometime probably maybe a little after AD 70, AD 71, 2, 3, somewhere in there, would have come through and just taken swords and slashed all the scrolls that they could find in the area. At least that's what they tell us about the way they found them. Now this area, not looking very spectacular, not often in the paper, is really the area that was famous for the Dead Sea Scrolls, because this is where the first scrolls were found. They found Isaiah A, or Isaiah B as they're called, just two scrolls of Isaiah. The Habakkuk commentary, the Thanksgiving scroll, the Manual of Discipline, the War Rule, and the Genesis Apocryphon. So there's two books there that are of prime interest to Bible students, the two copies of Isaiah. And then the other books were primarily of interest to people who wanted to research the people who had those books. And that's quite a different way of looking at it. That's the man, Yigal Yadin. He was quite an important person in the Israeli government at the time. He was related to the army. He was related to the underground work of trying to preserve Jewish life. And this is what he had to say. Now, this is where I think a lot of the strength comes from. It's not my words. It's not a Christadelphians' words. It's the man who actually discovered them. And he said this. This is right in the book, The Message of the Scrolls. He says, I cannot avoid the feeling that there is something symbolic in the discovery of the scrolls and their acquisition at the moment of the creation of the state of Israel. It is as if these manuscripts had been waiting in caves for 2,000 years, ever since the destruction of Israel's independence, until the people of Israel had returned to their home and regained their freedom. This symbolism is heightened by the fact that the first three scrolls were bought by my father for Israel on the 29th of November 1947, the very day on which United Nations voted for the recreation of the Jewish state in Israel after 2,000 years. The emphasis is mine on that. He didn't emphasize that, I did. But it illustrates the critical thing. When you think of that, you see the scrolls a little bit different light. Because here the scrolls were in a cave with an opening that stayed open for 2,000 years. And all anybody had to do was take a stone and throw it through the opening, and you could crash one of those jars. For 2,000 years. No animals went in and destroyed them. People went in and nobody went in and looted them. And they were just sitting there until that day. Well, it led up to that day, because it was maybe a week or two before that the scrolls finally got from the Bedouins to an antiquities dealer across Jerusalem to a professor that they knew in the Jewish university who could examine them, because no one could read them, and they thought they were fake, because no one believed the scrolls could exist that long and still be readable. So there was quite a time of identification to prove that these things were what they thought they were. Well, the thing is, this is the way God works. And you see, Bible students see this, and people who don't know their Bibles miss it entirely. But in Exodus chapter 12, verses 40-41, it says, "Now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. And it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, even the selfsame day, it came to pass that all the hosts of Yahweh went out of the land of Egypt." That's our God. And you see, that's a fingerprint of our God. He does things exactly on time. So when you come back and you look at whether this is a coincidence or prophecy being fulfilled, you need to answer these questions, or at least look at these points. A scroll of Isaiah was placed in a jar in this cave sometime while the land of Israel was being destroyed by the Roman armies. That's back in AD 70. Either a little bit before it, possibly a little bit after it. About 2,000 years passed without the scroll being discovered or disturbed. Then, while one of the main prophecies in the scroll was being fulfilled, it was rediscovered in 1947. I think that's the evidence of the touch of the divine hand. But it's only there for people who know the Bible to see it. Those who have it, they get more. And those who don't have it get nothing. And that's why Bible students, I think, really rejoiced around the Dead Sea Scrolls, just to see the timing. It just happened so exactly, so precisely. And you'll see as I go on, there's even a few more things that we'd want to consider. When you go to Jerusalem and you look at the new city, and you see there's the Knesset building, the Parliament buildings, and here's the university, not the university, rather the museum complex of buildings, and there's the Shrine of the Book right there. So it's something that if you ever get to Jerusalem, ever want to go through that, it would take you a good day to go, well, maybe even more than a day, to go through that museum complex and the Shrine of the Book. Shrine of the Book is a little bit disappointing for people to know their Bibles, because what I expected when I went in there was that they were going to make something of the book of Isaiah. They would talk about the prophecies of the book of Isaiah, not a mention. What was highlighted in the Shrine of the Book was the history of the people who had actually hidden the book, or hidden the scrolls, or were looking after the scrolls in the library. And it was just all about that. It takes Christadelphians who know this to show people what is the significance of those scrolls. And how it is that with all these things happening in the world, and Israel coming back to life after all those years of dispersion, and here we find a scroll that's talking about it, one of the scrolls, and it's found just at the time it's going on. That's the hand of God. At least for me it is. The Shrine of the Book is an interesting place. It's not hard to understand sort of some of the way it's presented. There's just a big black wall separating as you go down into the exhibit from the top of it, which is the top which sort of marks it in Jerusalem, the top of what would appear to be a jar in which the scrolls were hid. So if you get behind the black wall, you don't see anything, and then suddenly it's there. And that seems to me to be a good display of it. Now, let's see where else you can go with this. This is also in the same book. You can get this book on Amazon, used books, and very cheaply. If you just go on Amazon, used books, and look for that title with that author, Yigal Yadin, and you can find this for yourself. I would say that's a good book to have in your library. The great antiquity of the Dead Sea Scrolls. He says, thus we know that even from the second source, the Septuagint, we have not full texts of the Bible earlier than the 4th century AD. In the light of that fact, it is easy to appreciate the great importance of two Isaiah texts discovered among the Qumran scrolls. These texts are about 1,000 years older than the oldest Hebrew text known to us, and about 500 years older than the earliest Greek version of the Septuagint. And the question people wanted to answer was, what's the difference? Because we've been told that if people had those old scrolls and they copied them, and they copied them, and they copied them, that the version that we have now in the 21st century couldn't possibly be like the originals, just because of the errors that would creep in. So when people had a chance to look at these texts, were so about 1,000 years older than any of the Hebrew texts they had, that's what they wanted to know. Well, again, this is Jehova speaking. What is astonishing is that despite their antiquity and the fact that the scrolls belong to this pre-standardization period, they are on the whole almost identical with the Masoretic text known to us. This establishes a basic principle for all future research on texts of the Bible. Not even the hundreds of slight variations established in the text, affecting mainly spelling and occasional word substitution, can alter that fact. So much for the people who said to us that the Bible is unreliable. That's a sensational find. To find the scroll, to see it, to look at it, for people who could read that ancient Hebrew text and compare it with what we have, and to be able to say there's hardly any difference except God's word substitution and some spelling. Now it's interesting, because it would seem that God knew that it wouldn't be appropriate to discover these scrolls any earlier than the technology that was needed to put them together. So if they were discovered in, say, the 60s, 1960s, if they were discovered, I shouldn't say if discovered, because they were obviously discovered before that, but it took certain technologies to develop, which were actually in developing, but didn't develop until some years after they were discovered. But if they had been discovered, say, a century beforehand, they might have just been left on the bookshelves altogether. The people wanted to be able to sort them out. Now, the way it was explained to me by an Israeli guide was this. He said, you take a big package of 3 different types of potato chips. So you got one brand here, you got another package here, another package here. He says, bash them all up until they're just little bits and pieces. He says, put them in a bowl and mix them all up. He says, put them on a table and then reassemble them so they go back into the bags. It'd be pretty hard to do. He says that was the task. There was 19,000 fragments of these texts. They were scattered all over the caves. How could they possibly put these things back together? Well, this is what they did. So let me just read this to you for those at the back who couldn't possibly read this. Today's scholarly opinion regarding the time span and background of Dead Sea Scrolls is anchored in historical, paleographic, and linguistic evidence corroborated firmly by carbon-14 datings. Some manuscripts were written and copied in the 3rd century BCE, but the bulk of material, particularly the texts that reflect on a sectarian community, are originals or copies from the 1st century. Now, there was 3 technologies needed to develop, and that came in the 1980s to be able to assist in the analysis of the scrolls. The first thing was, it was demonstrated in this little demonstration by this Jewish guide at the actual booth in Qumran, and he said they needed to have an infrared technology because they couldn't even see writing without infrared. But when they shot an infrared light on these little pieces of skin from animals, he says you could right away identify that there was something written there. And then he says, the DNA analysis permitted scientists to piece together which fragment came from which scroll. Well, they were written on animal skins. Animals have different DNA. So once you can do a DNA analysis on all of these pieces, you can start to identify what animal they came from. So that allows you to put them in groups. So you can see that before that, they really didn't have much of a chance. And then carbon-14 dating provided the proof of the age of the scrolls. So it wasn't a matter of people, taking something from some other part of the world and hiding them in there and just hoping someone would find them to fool the world, as is some of the ideas that people have come up with to try to explain away this. So these technologies were very significant in providing proof that what they found was the real thing. Now, in a sense, the scroll at Masada, or at least what I'm going to tell you about Masada, was more sensational than this. It wasn't really made much of by anybody, except by people like us who knew what the Bible said about the people of Israel. Now, Masada, at the bound part of the Dead Sea, is really a magnificent structure. It just looks like a big cliff until you get around to this side to see that white mark. Ramp that was made there back in probably AD 71, 72, somewhere in that region. And we know that history tells us there were Jewish zealots who had got away from Jerusalem after AD 70. They had taken over this big rock that was a palace of Herod's, and they were at the top of it, and they were essentially out of the reach of the Roman general Silva. But he came down, and he came down with a number of Jewish slaves as well as a Roman army, and they put a fence all around the perimeter. And you can see some of these marks here, which illustrates where the Romans had camped. So all that's there because really there was nothing happened. The land was left vacant since this all happened, and you go back there and just see it almost as it happened and as it was left. Here is a little example at this place where the chairlift takes you up of what the Roman wall may have looked like when the Romans came and established it to protect them during the night. And I'll just read this. I don't want to take too much time on this because this is what the Israelis make of Masada. And it's, again, reading from this book, Masada, Herod's Fortress and the Zealots' Last Stand. It says, it's thanks to Ben Yair and his comrades, to their heroic stand, to their choice of death over slavery, to the burning of their humble chapels as a final act of defiance to the enemy, that they elevated Masada to an undying symbol of desperate courage, a symbol which has stirred hearts throughout the last 19 centuries. It is this which moves scholars and laymen to make the ascent to Masada. It is this which moved the modern Hebrew poet to cry, Masada shall not fall again. It is this which has drawn the Jewish youth of our generation in their thousands to climb to its summit in a solemn pilgrimage. And it is this which brings the recruits of the armored units of the defense forces of modern Israel to swear the oath of allegiance on Masada's heights. Masada shall not fall again. Now there may be some here who don't know the story of this, and very briefly, this is what happened. The Zealots were up in this area. The Romans had made it a fort, and hence the Romans now had to really go against their own engineering to try to take the Zealots out. So what they did is they built a ramp, because there was really no way they could get into this by walking up. There's a snake path. If you ever walk that path, you'll know that it wouldn't be something that an army would ascend to assault the place. But he built this ramp up, and then the Romans apparently brought a siege engine up the ramp, right up to the top of the walls. They battered the wall through quite easily because it was not designed to resist a siege engine. And then instead of going right in and taking the Zealots out, they all went back down and came up the next day because they felt now they could easily get in. But by that night, the Jews had covered it up. They had some wood and they had some enough earth up there to pack against it that they made it actually harder and stronger than it was before. So the Romans thought, well, this is going to this is going to really set us back because you have to make another ramp that will take months of work to do that. So they thought of fire, because what the Jewish zealots had done is they put the wood across the openings and packed in earth behind it. And they thought they could burn it out. And they actually successfully did that after, at least the way it's written up. There was a couple of cases where the wind was blowing the opposite way. You get up in Masada, you'll find the wind is really quite high, blowing up or blowing across and down. So they managed to burn it out. They went back down and came up the next day. Well, the next day they went in and there was nobody alive. Because all the zealots had made a pact that they would rather die than face Rome. And so every man went back to his household, and he was responsible to kill his wife and his family. And then when they came back, they chose lots, so that there would be finally just one man left, who would then burn what was left and kill himself. When they came out, they were all dead. And that's what the Jews are talking about here. Masada shall not fall again. And take all the young Israelis up there to swear the oath of allegiance on Masada's heights. Well, Sister Dorothy and I went up there and walked around just to see this place, because I really thought there was something here worth seeing. And I think the Israeli government has made this place even more sensational, because they were assembling all kinds of lights, and apparently they had something they had in mind for night. We never went down there at night to see it, so I'm not sure what it turned out to be. But on the front of this edifice, or this large hill, Herod had made a palace. And you can go in and look at the little tiles that he had, that it was beautifully plastered and colored. There were all kinds of resources, water resources in there by Roman engineering to get water in there. It was a palace. And when Yagaliadin went down here to try to find scrolls, he thought there just might be a synagogue on the wall. And they did spot something that looked like it, because it was a spot that was facing Jerusalem. So they went to here, into this spot, to see if they could find any scrolls. Now, you need to know the idea of a geniza. That is the idea of how the Jews would dispense with old scrolls that are no longer of any use. Like, how would you get rid of your old Bibles? Have them still, which is quite likely. The people never throw them away. They're still there in your house somewhere in a box. Well, people just don't like throwing away an old religious book, and so what the Jews did is they buried them, and they called it a geniza. And the geniza would be likely associated with a synagogue. So they looked around, they didn't find anything, but they thought, well, maybe just check the floor. So they tore up the floor. And when they checked the floor, they found there was a couple places that looked like the earth had been moved and restored. So that was the sort of the clue. There's likely something buried there. And this kind of digging required something a lot more that happened, because there wasn't any digging required in these other caves. So they were in jars. The scrolls were in jars, and they went in there and took the jars out, and the scrolls were quite well preserved. But this was a place where they were buried. They had to dig, so very carefully. It's almost like with a toothbrush and a little pick, and they're digging down, digging down. Well, they had to get down about 3 feet until they found this. Now, you might be able to see a little bit of what appears to be writing there, because there was no scroll, there was no jar, but there was enough to illustrate that something written had been there. And lo and behold, what it says is that it was talking about this chapter and this in particular. Now, I just think that's sensational. There's a lot of Ezekiel that could be found. It's a big scroll. But it was the 37th chapter that was found. A little piece of writing. 37th chapter. What does it say? Then he said unto me, Son of man, these bones, don't forget, it's a geniza. It's a graveyard. These bones are the whole house of Israel. Behold, they say, our bones are dried, our hope is lost, we are cut off for our parts. Therefore prophesy and say unto them, Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, Behold, O my people, I will open your graves, and cause you to come up out of your graves, and bring you into the land of Israel. And you shall know that I am Yahweh when I have opened your graves, O my people, and brought you out of your graves, and shall put my spirit in you, and you shall live, and I shall place you in your own land. Then shall you know that I, Yahweh, have spoken it and performed it, saith Yahweh. And they made nothing of it, except just to go back to show you, that's the actual picture in his book. He shows you the picture, and he puts portions of the Ezekiel scroll containing the vision of the dry bones which were found in the second pit under the floor of the synagogue. Now that is something else. To find in a burial ground this chapter that talked about God, restoring them from the grave and the bones coming together and people making nothing of it after 2,000 years of dispersion, coming together like that. That's for us, brothers and sisters, young people. That's for you to know and to tell people, to tell your generation, to tell your friends that this is the evidence why we believe the Bible is God's Word. It testifies to the truth of the existence of the living God. Well, he did say, Ye are my witnesses, saith Yahweh, my servant whom I have chosen, that you may know and believe me, and understand that I am he. Before me there was no God, before neither shall there be after me. Who else, what other power anywhere could do what God did just in that little sample? So I want to just take a little brief sort of tour of a couple passages, not many passages, but just to illustrate some of the other things that can be made and have been brought to my attention by other brethren who have done their research. This verse here, Deuteronomy 28, verse 37, Thou shalt become an astonishment, a proverb, and a byword among all nations, whither Yahweh shall lead thee. The first person I heard talk about this was Brother Colin Badger. And he says the word there, byword, is shtenania, which is a word which means a gib, something pointed. And hence it's a taunt. And surely we hear the taunt associated with being Jewish in our day as well as these days since, when people have actually disobeyed God and gone out into the world. But I remember my dad telling me when I was a little boy in Toronto, telling me the Sheeny Man's coming. And I didn't know what he meant at that time, the Sheeny Man. Well, the Sheeny Man was this man. The word in the Hebrew became Sheeny. And a Sheeny Man was a Jewish man who was going around with a cart, most often with a horse, and he was picking up things from people who didn't want them anymore. And that's how we assumed he made his living. But that picture there is not Toronto. That's a picture somewhere in the States. I would have loved to be able to go back and take a picture of the Sheeny Man that I can still see in my mind as he's coming down the street with his horse and his wagon. This idea of hunting and fishing. Jeremiah 16, verse 16 to 18. Behold, I will send many fishers, saith Yahweh. They'll fish them. And I will send many hunters, and they shall hunt them from every mountain and from every hill, out of the holes of the rocks. Well, why would God ever use that expression? Except that he expects us to have a look and see. And, in Kristallnacht, and that was the night in Germany when, in fact, it seemed to illustrate to the Jews, this is coming. There's a great persecution coming. Deuteronomy 28, verse 65 said, And among these nations you will find no ease, neither shall the sole of thy foot have rest. But Yahweh will give thee a trembling heart, failing of eyes, and sorrow of mind. And that was just the beginning, the smashing of the plate glass windows and all the shops in that particular night. But nothing sort of brought this to my attention like that picture. And now this is in Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. And it may be that they have other cars like this on exhibit in various Holocaust memorials around the world. But it was a cattle car on a piece of track. And, well, I'll just go back on that a bit, because I was going to put something in on a display of it, but I tell you, the words are just too graphic. What it was like, where people were crowded into those cars, and it tells you about they were connected and taken from various places in Poland, in this case, and to the death camps. And then it says that the train stopped and people came in and robbed them to make sure that anything that they could get off them, they had gotten off of them, and people were treated like cattle. They were hunted. They were fished, just like people treating other people as if they were just animals and of no consequence whatsoever. I had the opportunity to go to Bergen-Belsen and just walk through that camp. And for those of you who have ever read the story of Anne Frank, and to see her monument that's there, and just to think about the Holocaust and what it meant to the world and what it meant to the Jewish people. The Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem is a very interesting display of the Jewish idea of the Holocaust. Sister Dorothy and I went through that twice to see if we could find the word God anywhere in there. And of all the things that the Bible says about what would happen to the Jews, there was no reference to God. It's no wonder that they don't make much out of the prophecies of Ezekiel, of God reviving the nation, when they can't explain this. What happened here is something they don't want to mention in terms of what really happened. So you go in there, and if you're Hungarian background, you go into the Hungarian sort of exhibit. If you're from a Polish background, you go into the Poland exhibit. And they're very well done, and they tell you what happened in those countries and how the people were taken from there one way or another to these death camps. You know, there's a monument there that mentions there's 2,500 bodies. And that was one of the last camps that people went to and photographed and saw what actually had taken place. Gruesome memorial there of that's right in the middle of Bergen-Belsen. You can see that the countryside, they have made it such that the grass never really gets green, and most of that part is just all looks dead and dying. But you see, God said in Ezekiel 36, verses 22 and 23, "Therefore say unto the house of Israel, Thus saith Yahweh God, I do not this for your sakes, O house of Israel, but for my holy name's sake, which you have profaned among the heathen whither you went. I will sanctify my great name, which was profaned among the heathen, which you have profaned in the midst of them. And the heathen shall know that I, Yahweh, saith Yahweh God, shall know that I am Yahweh, saith Yahweh God, when I shall be sanctified in you before their eyes." Now, we know that there's a number of very significant Bible passages in the New Testament with respect to the Jews. I will just move a little faster for the sake of time here, but that's one of them, in Luke 21, where it says in verse 24, "They shall fall by the edge of the sword, shall be led away captive into all nations. Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled." Well, if you walk around Jerusalem, you might not think that the times of the Gentiles is totally fulfilled, because there's a lot of evidence that it isn't. But one of the critical features of it was in 1967, when Jerusalem fell into the hands of the Israelis. But we must be living in the times of the Gentiles, and hence, or of the times when the Gentiles are fulfilled, rather. And so we're looking forward to what else says. It says in Romans chapter 11, verses 25 to 28, that they are beloved for the Father's sake. If there was anything needed to answer a Jehovah's Witness claim, or people who aren't sure that they really witness to God, then you can see it in what's written in these chapters in Romans. And, you know, we especially have paid attention to this one. In Romans 11, verses 13 to 15, "I speak to you Gentiles, and as much as I am the apostle of the Gentiles, I magnify mine office. If by any means I may provoke to emulation them which are of my flesh, and might save some of them. For if the casting away of them be the reconciling of the world, what shall the receiving of them be but life from the dead? And that's just one of the tantalizing prophecies of the Bible that would illustrate to us we must be very close to the time of the Lord's return, the time of the resurrection of the dead, and to the time of the rest of the fulfillment of these prophecies. Now, many of us have wondered about this one because it talks about them dwelling safely. In Ezekiel 38, verses 10 and 11, it says that the Gog of the land of Magog would come against them, and it says he will go up to the land of unwalled villages. I will go to them that are at rest, that dwell safely, all of them without walls, having neither bars nor gates. And it's the most walled place you ever want to visit. There's walls everywhere around Israel. So what do we make of this? Well, when it says that they dwell safely, we do know that it's confidence. And I tend to think that maybe we should be looking in an area like this for what that means. During the most recent war with Gaza, and while rockets were flying over the head of this plant, because this is from Gath. This plant, I guess I must have obliterated the little bit I had on there when I put that title on the bottom. But this is found in Gath, right next to Gaza. And rockets would have been fired over this plant to go to northern Israel. And while they were firing them, the Israeli government and Intel announced a $6 billion expansion of their investment in this plant. I'd say that's confidence. If they were firing that in Canada, if there was rockets firing over any place, they would be not thinking of expanding that plant. They'd be thinking of replacing it, repositioning it somewhere else. But that's not Israel. And even though it seems to be beyond reason to see that people would do that, they did it at that very time. I think God tells us by these little inconsistencies to pay attention to what's going on. I'm sure every one of us know what's happened, which 50 years ago we were scratching our heads over. Like, where's the spoil? What is it that's going to attract someone down to little Israel? Well, that's changed. To take a spoil, to take a prey, to turn thine hand upon the desolate places that are now inhabited, upon the people that are gathered out of the nations, which have gotten cattle and goods and dwell in the midst of the land. And with the great discovery of oil and gas there, we now see ships like this going around the world taking liquid natural gas to various ports that are being set up for it. Which means that Israel, with those two large gas finds they had in the Mediterranean, could very well be an attractive spoil. And who knows how this is going to unfold, brothers and sisters. Like we learned that lesson, didn't we? When in the 60s, and in the 70s, maybe even into the 80s, we were seeing Russia or the Warsaw Pact countries and the NATO countries. We see sort of the boundaries there. And we might have expected at that time that the only way that boundary would come down would be through war. And then the Berlin Wall came down. And then the Soviet Union disbanded. And then many of the nations in Eastern Europe, without firing a shot, just changed sides. And it was unexpected. So we maybe back off a little. I'm sure brethren in our area have learned to do that from how these things will happen. But we know they will happen. So there's a spoil we never saw before, but whether this is the real spoil or whether something else has got to show up, we don't know. It's just encouraging to see that there is something to answer that question. What is the spoil? Well, it very well could be oil. But when you see a man like President Putin on the world stage, who is willing to go into the Ukraine, willing to go into and take Crimea because there's so many Russian citizens there, you think, Israel has got a large share of its population are Russian-speaking people. And it probably would occur to you to think that there could be other reasons why this Gog of the land of Magog would come down to take a spoil. And I leave this with you with this last slide, brothers and sisters, because this hasn't happened yet. But what a time it will be when it does happen. Zechariah 8, verse 20 to 23, thus saith Yahweh of hosts, It shall yet come to pass, there shall come people and the inhabitants of many cities, and the inhabitants of one city shall go to another, saying, let us go speedily to pray before Yahweh, to seek Yahweh of hosts. I will go also. Yea, many people and strong nations shall come to seek Yahweh of hosts in Jerusalem, and to pray before Yahweh. Thus saith Yahweh of hosts, in those days it shall come to pass that 10 men shall take hold out of all the languages of the nations, even shall take hold of the skirt of him that is a Jew, saying, we will go with you, for we have heard that God is with you. You see, that elevates our God. They're witnesses that our God is God. And so when these people come up, they will come to be with the Jew because they have heard that God is with them. We have a wonderful heritage, young people. We hope that you will accept that heritage, and that if there's people thinking about whether or not the Bible's reliable, well, consider the evidence. There's nothing like it in the earth. And it's on that foundation that we as Christadelphians have built our faith and look forward to the coming of our Lord. Thank you.